Okay, so it's time to go ahead and get started today. So like I mentioned last class, today's class is mostly going to be lab. I'm going to go over the diagram to lab 4. Okay, so as you're doing the lab, hopefully after I talk about it, you'll have a good understanding of what the circuit is doing, okay, what the diagram is doing. And in order to understand lab 4, you really have to understand signed choose complement binary numbers, and also signed binary addition and signed binary subtraction by addition using choose complement. So last class basically you have to have a good understanding of what we talked about on Tuesday. So before I talk about lab 4, I just want to briefly review choose complement numbers, and then also addition with choose complement and subtraction by addition with choose complement. So the first thing I have as a question for you is, if we have choose complement and we have a positive number, what is the most significant bit going to be equal to? And why is that? What do we call this most significant bit? It's the what bit? Right, it's the sign bit, right? It tells you the sign of that number. And it's been agreed upon that when you have a choose complement number, or any sign number, binary number for that matter, 0 for the sign bit means you have a positive number. So if I had, for example, the 0, 0, 1, 0, right, 4-bit RC, what is this equal to in base 10? We know it's positive, and then how do we get the magnitude, the number? Yeah, you just do it like an unsigned number, right? This is the 1's column, the 2's column, the 4's column. But again, the sign bit doesn't have numerical value, right? Again, it just tells you the sign. So this would be +2. Okay, so everybody good? All right, but now, if it's a negative number, what is this most significant bit going to be equal to? It's going to be equal to a 1. It's been agreed upon when you have signed binary numbers. If the most significant bit, the sign bit's a 1, that means you have a negative number. Okay, so let's say we have this 4-bit choose complement signed binary number. It's 1, 0, 1, 0. Now we know it's negative because of the sign bit being 1. But how do we get the magnitude if it's a negative choose complement? We do what, then what? Yeah, flip the bits and add 1. Right? So we flip the bits. They flip them right. If I make a mistake, let me know. And then we add 1. 0, 1, 0. So this represents -6. Right? Did I do that right? Okay. So, any questions? Now, we talked about some other things on Tuesday, like we talked about other forms that are used for signed binary numbers, like sign magnitude and 1's complement. But for lab 4, all you need to have a good handle on is 2's complement. And when you take CPE133, they're going to 2's complement there too. Okay. All right. Now, also we talked about that there's these validity rules that anytime you do addition or subtraction by addition, with binary numbers, you always want to make sure your result is valid, right? We have 3 rules, right? 3 validity rules. Can somebody give me one of those 3? Right. You take a positive and you add it to a negative, it's always valid. Okay. Can someone else give me the second one?
Positive, always have to be positive
in order to be valid. Right. Okay, exactly. So yeah, if you're adding 2 positives, to be valid, it has to be positive. And again, if you just think of a number line, right? I mean, Doesn't make any sense. You had two positive, get a negative, right? Doesn't make any sense. So therefore, the other one, the third one, right, is just a negative plus a negative. It's valid if you get a negative. Okay, so those are our three validity rules. Now, remember, we also talked about last class that another way to think of whether your result is valid or not is looking at your result and seeing if it's within the range that you could possibly have based on that number of bits. Okay, do you remember the range for 2's complement if it's 4 bits? That was on the handout that I gave you on Tuesday. What's the most negative number you could get if you have 4-bit 2's complement? Negative. What's the most positive? Plus that. Okay, so yeah, if you got a result that's outside that range, then yeah, that's invalid. And so there's another way of looking at it. These are the three rules. Okay. All right, so let's just do an example here of addition. So remember, when you're doing addition of signed binary numbers, you approach it the same way as when you're doing unsigned. Again, the difference is when you have signed binary numbers, is that most significant bit column, that's the signed column, right? It doesn't have numerical value. But you just go ahead and add these like you normally would, right? So 1 plus 0 is just 1, then 1 plus 1 is 0, carry the 1. So in your result, this is also the signed bit. So we talked about this on Tuesday. If you get a bit to the left of the signed bit, what do you do with that bit? You just ignore it. It doesn't have any meaning. Okay, but you don't even consider it. Okay, so what would you say about our result here? Right, invalid, right? Because we're adding 2 negatives, and look, the sign bit came out positive, right? So that's invalid. Okay, we could convert these to base 10 just, to make sure, right? Again, like when you did that activity on Tuesday, some people came up and asked, well, do I have to change it to base 10? No, you don't have to, but I think it's always a good idea, especially when you're first learning, just to make sure, it's coming out what you expected. So what is 1, 1, 1, 1 in base 10? What is this 2's complement number in base 10? Negative what? 1. Negative 1, right? Because again, the sign bit being 1 tells us it's negative. To get the value, you flip all the bits, add 1, right? So you flip all the bits, it's 0, add 1. Okay, how about 1, 0, 0, 0? 1, 0, 0, 0, 3 zeros. What is that in base 10? What is that 2's complement number in base 10? Eight. Negative 8. Okay. Because again, the sign bit tells us it's negative. Then you flip the bit, 0, 1, 1, 1, which is 7. Then you add 1, so it's negative 8. So look, we were adding negative 1 to negative 8. So the answer, negative 9, but can you represent negative 9 with 4-bit 2's complement? No, the most negative you can represent with 4-bit 2's complement is negative 8. So see, that's another way to tell that it's invalid, right? Because the result would be outside the range of what you can represent with that number of bits. Okay? So any questions up to this point? All right, so then we also talked about binary subtraction with 2's complement. But we said we don't do straight binary subtraction. And do you remember the reason, again, why you don't see like straight binary subtraction, that subtraction's done by addition? What was the reason again? Right, exactly. Yeah. If we took the subtraction rules for 1-bit subtraction, we'd get a different truth table, a different K-map, different equation. So it'd be different hardware, right? But if you can do subtraction by addition, you can use the same adding circuit to do subtraction. So that's the reason. Okay. All right. So if we have subtraction like this, and this is my A number, this is my B number. What do I have to do before I go to add here. What am I gonna do to this B number? I'm gonna do it. Flip it in. Add one. In other words, I'm gonna take the 2's complement, right? Because like we talked about last class, that A minus B is the same thing as A plus the negation of B. And the way that you negate B in 2's complement is you take the 2's complement, right? So remember last class I was talking about, there's 2's complement, the noun, right? And that's like the listing of the 2's complement numbers. And then there's 2's complement, the verb. And 2's complement, the verb, is you're negating whatever binary you take the 2's complement of, it negates it. Okay, so in order to add these two, we would just take the same A number, we don't change that at all. But now to add it to the negation of this, we take the 2's complement of this. Right, so we flip the bits, 1, 0, 1, 1, and then we add 1. Okay, flip the bits right. And then 0, carry 1, 0, 1, 1, 1. So you see, we would add it to the 2's complement of this. Right, and you can see that it negates it, right? Because this is positive 4, right? Plus 4, the sign bit is 0, so plus 4. And then when I take the 2's complement, this is negative 4, right? Because the 1 tells me, 1 being the sign bit tells me it's negative. Then if I flip these bits and add 1, I get 4. Okay, so now you just go ahead and add this. So 1, 0, 1, 1, 1 carry the 1, 1 plus 0 plus 1 is 0, carry the 1. And so again, we get a bit to the left of the sign bit, but again, we don't care about that. And we can check to see if this made sense. What's this in base 10? 5, right? And then what we said just a moment ago, that's minus 4. So you should get 1, and that's 1. So you see this is valid. And also we would know it's valid because we're adding a positive to a negative, right? So, okay. All right, so this was, review from last time. Let me turn the camera before I forget. I got to start a new streak. I ended my streak in the 3 to 6 section on Tuesday. I forgot to turn it, so I got to start a new streak today. Yeah, I didn't go quite far enough. Okay, there it is. Okay, so up to this point, it hasn't been anything new, right? This was, like I said, just a brief review of what, most of what we covered on Tuesday. Okay, but any questions before I continue? Because now we're going to talk about lab 4. Okay, so the diagram up on the whiteboard, it should be the same one on Canvas. I tried to be real careful and get everything right. Hopefully, everything matches. Now, one thing to note right away before I forget, because this question comes up unless I say something about it, and that's, the internal signals, right? The signals you need to connect between lower level modules. You can see they're labeled T1, T3, and so on. There is no T2, and that's because originally this diagram had something else that required a T2 that has been since deleted, and I didn't go back and renumber these. Okay, hopefully, and I've said this a number of times, but again, I think it's good to repeat it. It would be better if when you do this that you're more descriptive with these internal signals. Okay, instead of using T1, T3, and so on, maybe this is mux underscore B or something, where you're actually being more descriptive of what's getting connected, right? Because this is connecting the output of this mux to this B input. So you could put something like mux underscore B or something to that effect. Again, when you take CPE133, you really don't want to number. You don't want to name things like T1, T2, T3, because again, when you do that microprocessor with so many connections, when you go to troubleshoot it, you want to have some description for those internal signals. They'll just make your life easier. Okay. In this class, not as important because the circuitry is not as big, but still it's good to get into good habits. Okay, the first thing I want to ask you is, remember, we have this high level black box diagram. This is the low level structural model. Okay, but then we have our high level black box diagram. And again, the high level black box diagram, what's the main purpose of that diagram? It tells us what, or shows us what? Yeah, the main inputs and outputs. So in this diagram, what are our main inputs? A, B, and sub, okay? So just like in lab 3, you have these two 4-bit binary numbers that are going to be added. So that's the same, right? You had that in lab 3. These 4-bit A and B binary numbers, right? But now there's an additional input labeled sub. And you'll see the purpose of that coming up. Okay, and it's a single bit. This is just a single bit input. Okay, how about outputs? What are our main outputs? You got seg, just like you did in lab 3. You got an, again, that's short for anode, just like lab 3. But now you also have an additional output, neg, that's a single bit. Okay, so our outputs, got seg, an, and then also neg. So, you know, A and B are going to go to switches just like they did in lab 3. Sub is also going to go to a switch. So in lab 4, you're going to have 9 switches, right? 4 for A, 4 for B, and then a single one for sub. And you can pick whatever switches you want for those. Okay? In your constraints file, right? That's where you can pick like which one's on the board. Okay, now lab 4, we're going to display the results on the 7-segment display, just like in lab 3. So that's why you got the seg output and the AN. So in your constraints file, it's going to be exactly the same as what you did for lab 3. But now you'll have an additional output, this neg, that goes to an LED. Okay, so you'll have to use, you know, one of the LEDs on your basis board for neg. Okay. All right, so let's see what this circuit is doing. And we're going to start over here. Okay, we're going to start where you see this mux along with this inverter and this ripple carryout. Now, I mentioned on Tuesday, and perhaps some of you were able to do this before today, but I mentioned on Tuesday that this RCA has to be modified from what you have from, what was it, lab 2 and also lab 3. You use the RCA in lab 3 too. Where now we want our RCA to have a C-in input along with the A and B input. So like I mentioned on Tuesday, you need to take your RCA and replace the half adder with a full adder. So this RCA, both of these for lab 4, is going to contain 4 full adders. And the carry in of the full adder that you replace the half adder with, that needs to connect to the main carry in of the RCA. So you're going to have to add this input to your RCA and then connect it to the C in of that full adder that replaced the half adder. Okay? And in fact, that's the first thing to do in lab 4. You know, do that modification, and then you're going to have to test it again. You're going to have to sim it again. You can't just assume that, you know, you put the full adder in there and it's going to work, right? After you modify it, now you're going to have to sim that RCA again, you know, use the same 10 test cases that you did previously, and then add another 10 where Cn is equal to 1, and make sure for those 20 test cases that it's giving you the desired result, okay, the expected result. Okay. Okay. So let's see what's going on here. So the first thing is, you know, let's say A and B are, you know, set to some numbers. Now, we're interpreting these numbers as 2's complements. Okay. Remember, way back a few weeks ago when we were talking about, these zeros and ones and how they represent voltage levels. I mean, in of themselves, the zeros and ones are just voltage levels. They have no meaning other than their voltage. It's the circuitry that gives them meaning. So this circuit is interpreting the zeros and ones that you put on these switches, right? By setting the switches, it's interpreting it as 2's complement. Okay. All right, so let's start with sub being a 0. Okay, so that's going to be whatever switch you pick on the basis board when you put in the down position, right? It's going to read it as a 0. Okay, well, look, this sub input, it's connected to the select of this mux. Right? You already have a mux made, right? So you can just use the mux from your previous design. And we've talked about how muxes work. If I put a 0 on this select input, what am I going to get at the output of this mux? 0. What's connected to the 0 input? And the 0 input is connected right to B. See, the 1 input is connected to the output of an inverter, where the input of that inverter is B. So you see here, at the input of the 1 input of the mux, I have not B, right? Because it gets inverted. But here at the 0 input of the mux, I just have B because it connects directly to that input. So if I have a 0 on the select line, I'm going to get B out of the mux. And this output of the mux goes into our B input of our RCA. Now also, this sub is connected to the C in of the RCA. It's directly connected, so that's going to be a 0, right? Saying this is sub. So the RCA, when sub is equal to 0, the RCA is going to take whatever's on the A input, whatever's on the B input, and just add them together, and that's going to be at the output of the RCA. We'll have A plus B at that output. Okay? So does that make sense? Get a different color here. Okay. All right, so that's what happens on this part of the circuit when sub is equal to 0. Okay, so now let's say sub is equal to 1. Well, sub equals 1, it's going to make the select a 1. So now what's going to be at the output of this mux if the select is 1? It's going to be not B, right? Because again, the way a mux works, the select determines which input gets connected to the output, right? So when the select is 1, now not B is at the output of the mux, which is the same as flipping the bits of B, right? That's how you get not B, you flip the bits of B. Also, our C input is a 1. So now when the RCA goes to add these inputs, it's taking B flipped and it's adding 1. So effectively, what is it doing to B if it's flipping it and then adding 1? It's taking the 2's complement of B and it's negating it and then adding it to A. So now at the output, you're going to get A minus B, right? Because it's doing A plus the negation of B, which is the same as A minus B. So you see, the reason we're having you add that C input to the RCA, having the full 4 full adders, is it makes it easier to get the 2's complement of B and therefore get A minus B at the output of the RCA. You could leave your RCA the way it was with the half adder and then have like a whole nother RCA that adds 1 to the negation of B before you add it to A. Like you could have a whole nother RCA. In fact, that's why there's no longer a T2, because that's originally how this circuit was. But then I think it was Dr. Benson came up with this, right? Which is a much more eloquent design. Okay. All right. So any questions up to this point? Does everybody see how, this is why this input's called sub, because when sub is 1, we're subtracting. When sub is 0, we're adding. Okay. All right. The next thing we're going to look at is this right here. okay, validity check. And this is a new module. This you're gonna have to, design from scratch, okay? And this module is gonna perform these rules. Okay, so notice the inputs. Right, we got 3 inputs to the validity check module. One of the inputs goes to the 3rd bit of A, right? So the 3rd bit of this 2's complement number that we're adding or subtracting. And then this B input goes to the 3rd bit of the B number. And then this S input goes to the 3rd bit of this sum output of the RCA. So why do you think we're using the 3rd bit when it comes to validity checking? Like, what is that 3rd bit? The 3rd bit, that's that most significant bit.
Like starts at 0, so the 3rd bit would be the last digit.
Or the furthest to the left. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly, which is the sign bit. Right? The reason you see 3 here is that's the sign bit, because Rockman just said, the least significant bit, that's the 0th bit, right? And the 1st bit, 2nd bit, 3rd. Okay, so the 3rd bit, that's the most significant bit, which is the sign bit. And it's the sign bit that matters when you're doing these validity rules, right? Right, because if you have something that's positive, you got to look at the sign bit. And you need the inputs as well as the output, right? Because you got to look at the sign of the inputs and then look at the sign of the output to see whether it's valid or not. Okay. And when you design this validity checker, there's basically 2 approaches that you can use. One approach, well, there's at least 2. The 2 most common ones that I see is that some people will use an if statement. Okay. Another approach I've seen people use is that they'll make a truth table. They'll have their A, B, and S, right? These 3 inputs, A, B, S, and they'll have their output valid, right? And then they just go through the different combinations, right? They're all 0, 0, 0, 1. They go all the way till they're all 1, right? So they're going to be 8 rows in that truth table, and then they'll write whether it's valid or not based on the rules. And then they'll take this truth table, they'll put it into a K-map, right? 8-cell K-map. And then from the K-map, they get the reduced expression for valid. And then all they have is just one assign statement, right? This goes back to, what you were doing in the first couple of labs, right? Where you had some truth table, you put in a K-map, come out the Boolean expressions, and then, in your Verilog, you would assign, assign valid, you'd have some Boolean expression. So, there's if statement, there's, doing this approach. I've also seen people use a case statement. When they use a case statement, like they'll use, remember we learned about concatenation, where you can join bits together. So I've seen people use concatenation to join these 3 bits together, and then that's in their sensitivity list of their case statement. These are the 2 most popular ways of doing it, but I've seen people use a case statement too. But that's going to be your decision what to use here. Okay, you got to figure out, which one to use is really personal preference, but then you got to figure out, what the if statement has to be, or you got to figure out what the equation has to be. Okay. All right, but let's see now. We talked about the input side, why the inputs are connected to the 3rd bit, but let's see what the output of this validity checker is connected to. Well, you can see it's connected over here to the select of this mux. And this mux should look familiar because it's connected to the same data as lab 3, right? Where one of the inputs is all 1s, the other one's 1, 1, 1, 0. So what was this doing in lab 3? What was this mux accomplishing in lab 3?
So carry on 1 segment.
Yeah, one display, exactly. Right, that when this data was chosen, because this furthest to the right bit is a 0, that would turn on the furthest to the right 7-segment display, right? But when this input was chosen, where we have all ones, that would turn all the displays off. So the MUX is doing the same thing. The only thing that's different is that in lab 3, the select went to your carry out of your RCA because you wanted to blank the displays when the carry out was equal to a 1, right? You only wanted to display results less than, 15 or less when the carry out was 0. Here, we're determining whether there's a display light based on whether a result is valid or not. So if the result is not valid, okay, your module, if it's not valid, your module should output a 0. And when a 0 gets outputted, we're going to have all ones at the output of this MUX, and that's going to turn off all the displays, right? Because all the anodes, or I should say the inverter going into the anode will all be ones, which make the anodes all 0, like we talked about before. Remember, there's that inverter between this here and where the common anode of the displays is at. Okay, but if the valid output here is a 1, well, then we'll have 1, 1, 1, 0 at the output of this MUX, and that will turn on the furthest to the right display. Right, and then of course the segments will determine, which segments. Okay, so everybody see that it's doing exactly the same thing as in lab 3. It's just being controlled by a different output instead of a carry out being controlled by the output of your validity checker. Now, also, this validity output goes to the input of this AND gate. Remember, this is an AND gate. You should know the gates by their symbols by now. Okay. Remember that AND gate's got like that straight vertical here. If it's curvy, it's an OR, but that's an impedance. Okay. Okay, we'll talk about this AND gate at this point here, but before we concentrate on that at the moment, let's look at, well, let's say that the result of either this addition or subtraction, right? The number that we have at the output of this RCA, the sum output of this RCA, let's say it's positive. So the most significant bit is a 0. And it doesn't really matter what's after that for this discussion. The main thing is, let's say that the result at the output of that RCA, the sum output of that RCA is a positive. Therefore, its sign bit is 0. Well, look, the other input of this AND gate, right? One input to the AND gate is this valid output, but the other input of this AND gate, it goes to the sum output, which is the same as T3, because T3 is just connecting the sum output to the inverter and all that we see here, this MUX input 0 and also this input of this AND gate. Well, again, this 3 means that it's just taking the third bit of T3, which is the same thing as the third bit of the sum output. Okay, so if our result is a 0, if it's positive, it's going to put a 0 on this AND gate, on that input of the AND gate. And if I have a 0 at one input of an AND gate, do I have to care about what the other input is? No, because the output's going to be 0. And look where the output of the AND gate goes. The output of the AND gate goes to the select, and it also goes to this neg output. So if our result is positive, this AND gate is going to output a 0, and that's going to turn off the LED, the neg LED, which means that it's not a negative result, it's a positive result. Okay. Also, this 0 goes to the select of this MUX. And notice this MUX, the 0 input goes to the sum of the RCA, The one input goes to the sum of this RCA. But if I have a 0 on this select, whatever data I have at this input 0 of the mux, that's what's going to be at the output. So I would get this output, this 0, 1, 0, 1 at the output of that mux when we have a positive number. And then this decoder is the same decoder you had for lab 3. Okay, so you don't have to do anything to this decoder. You just keep it the way you have it. You don't have to modify it. So it's just going to display that positive number on the 7-segment display, just like you saw in lab 3. Okay, so if this result of this first RCA, if it's a positive number, this part of the circuit is not involved. Okay, you'll see when this part of the circuit is involved in just a second. Okay, but when you have a positive result at the sum output of this RCA, that number is going to be displayed, and the negative output is going to be off, indicating that it's positive. Now, if it's an invalid result, right, it's going to turn off the display. So, if it's an invalid result, it won't show at all. It will only show if it's a valid result. Did you have a question?
Oh, yeah, I was just wondering, so the RCA two, just like this strip, is it just like treated negative?
We're going to get to RCA2 coming up right now. But before I start, I just want to make sure that when this is positive, does everybody see what's going on? That because this is a 0, it's going to choose, well, first of all, the output of the AND gate is going to be 0, which is going to turn off the neg light, meaning it's positive. Also, this mux is going to choose whatever's at the sum output, which is positive, and just display it. Okay, that when there's a positive at the output of this RCA sum, this part of the circuitry is not involved. And you're thinking correctly. It's going to be involved if the result is negative. And we're going to talk about that right now. But before I talk about when a result is negative, when the result is positive, does it make sense to people what's going on?
So that thing with display, the validity checker display, asking if there's, so where do you get that?
Oh, well, that's going to be based on, your if statement or.
In the circuit, like what prevents the set of picture display from displaying?
Oh, well, it's right here, this mux, that if the result is not valid, you have a 0.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, so right here, it turns it off. Yeah, so you would never see an invalid result. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so now, and this is probably, see, the reason I say this for last is this is probably the most common reason, like, people don't understand lab 4, or they have some sort of problem. It's not understanding this part that is the difficulty most of the time, if there is a difficulty. Okay, so if we have a negative result, the most significant bit is going to be a 1. And let's say it's 1, 0, 1, 0. Okay. Well, now, because this third bit's a 1, that's going to put a 1 on the input of that AND gate. If our result is valid, it will also put a 1 at the other input of the AND gate. So if our result is negative and it's valid, the output of the AND gate will be a 1, which will turn on the LED, meaning we have a negative result. And also, because it's valid, it will be displayed. Okay. This select of this mux will be a 1. Right? Because it's the same as the output of the AND that goes to that neg output. So now, what's connected to the 1 input of the mux will be here at the output of this mux that goes to your decoder. Well, let's look at what RCA2 is doing. RCA2 is taking the result of RCA1, the sum, and it's inverting, right? So it's going to take that result invert it. Did I invert it right? Then invert it. It's going to add it to 0 and also add it to 1. See, this C input, when you see this 1 with the quotations, this C input is being connected directly to a 1. And this B input, because it's 4 bits, it's being connected to 4 zeros. So essentially, what this RCA is doing, it's just inverting this output and adding 1. Right? So it's flipping the bits of this output and adding 1, which means it's doing what? It's doing the 2's complement. And when you take the 2's complement, take the 2's complement, the verb, you're negating what you already have. Right? And can you see why we want to do that? Because if we didn't have this part of the circuitry, right? If we didn't have this inverter with the RCA along with this mux, and I connected the sum output of this RCA directly to your decoder, and you had, if you have 1 0 1 0 going into your decoder, what is it going to display? Because how did you design that decoder? For an input of 1 0 1 0, what would it display based on how you designed it with that case statement? You had a case statement 0 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10 11 12 13 14 15. For 0, you have it displaying a 0. For 1, you have it displaying a 1. It was what? A. Yeah. Right. See, if you didn't have this part of the circuit and this sum went right into your decoder, it would just take this as 10 and display an A, because you designed this to treat what's going into it as hex, right? To display hex. But now we wanted to display 2's complement. So this circuitry here is taking this and negating it, so now it shows the correct negative number. And it's all based on how you design. Now, another approach to this problem would be to modify this so it's not doing a hex conversion anymore, that it's doing like a 2's complement conversion. But, we chose to solve the problem this way because, again, it gives, I think it gives another more concrete example of taking the 2's complement, and inverting, the number. Okay. So, you see, having an understanding of this diagram helps when you troubleshoot, because when you put this all together, if your circuit is giving you like a correct positive number, like, when you set these to whatever numbers, and if it's a positive result, you're getting the right display. But for a negative result, something's not working right, like it's not giving the right display. Well, chances are there's a problem here, right? Because this is pertinent when you have a negative result, right? This is not relevant if you have a positive result. Okay, so that's where having an understanding of the diagram can help in the troubleshooting. And it is very likely that this circuit's not going to work the first time, right? Because now you're getting into, diagrams that have a lot more modules, a lot more connections, so there's a lot more room for error. So that's why last class I pointed out those general steps of troubleshooting that's on Canvas. Okay, so you should always refer to that when you run into a problem. You should look at those general steps and say, okay, did I sim all my lower level modules? Are they working the way they should? If that was good and something's not right with your upper level, you can look at the schematic, the elaborated design schematic. Okay, because a lot of times looking at that schematic, if you forget to connect something, it will show up there. And then, and this gets to the activity this week, there's a video that Dr. Benson made that's on Canvas. It's called Troubleshooting Video. And for the activity for today, and you see the activity today is different than past classes, right? Because prior to today, all the activities have been paper-based. This is demo-based. But the activity for today is, and it's not due today, it's due by the end of class next week, 11th. Now that's the same day as the midterm, but as I have in Canvas. The midterm's the first hour of class. And, you know, I know sometimes it's a challenge in an early morning class like this, but you need to be here at 10 past 8. I mean, I think like half the class has been pretty consistent being here on time, but the other half of the class that's been a little late or more than a little late, you need to get here on time on the 11th, because if you're late, you lose that time. You know, you have 60 minutes from 10 past the hour. You know, if you show up 15 minutes late, you only got 45 minutes. Okay. Also, you have to take the test in your enrolled section. I won't allow people to take it in a later section. Okay, so if you're not here and you miss it, I'm sorry, it's a 0. So you got to get here on time, especially Thursday next week. So the first hour is the midterm. Then after the midterm, there's going to be a short lecture. And then after the lecture, you'll have more time to work on this. If you need more time, hopefully you finish this before then. But like I said last week, I had this due the day after the midterm in case you run into a time crunch. You'll have an extra day after the midterm to finish it. But this activity of showing me that you can put an intermediate signal onto your timing diagram, like what's shown in Dr. Benson's troubleshooting video, that's the activity. As long as you can show me that, you're gonna get full credit. Also, it has to be on your computer or one of our computers. It can't be 2 people sharing a computer. I want to make sure each person can do it by themselves on a separate computer. Okay, and what's meant by this is that when you do a simulation on Vivado, in the timing diagram, it defaults to these main outputs. Like, if you just run a simulation for this overall module, it's going to show you, seg, neg, an, it shows you the inputs also. But there's a way, and Dr. Benson's video showed you how to do this. There's a way that you can take any intermediate signal and put it on the timing diagram. So as I have written here, I want you to show me that you can put this signal here, this output of this second RCA, that you can include that in the timing diagram along with these main outputs. And you see, this is really useful when you troubleshoot, because if you can put these intermediate signals onto your timing diagram, you can trace how the signal's going through the circuit. You can start here at the input and look at this output and say, oh, is that the right output based on what my select is? Oh, it is. Okay, that's good. All right, now, these are my inputs. Look at this output. Am I getting the right output based on those inputs? Oh, okay, I am. That's good. And you just keep going until you find a place where, hey, that's not what I expect. And then hey, well, this part of the circuit's fine, but the problem's somewhere around here. So this technique is how you isolate where a problem is when you start to get complex circuits like this. You'll definitely do this a lot in CPE133, okay? Because you're continually in that microprocessor, you're tracing signals through to see, where the problem first arises. Okay, so this is really good troubleshooting practice. Okay, I think I mentioned at the beginning of the class that one of the best skills an engineer can have, no matter what kind of engineer you are, no matter what kind of work you're doing, troubleshooting skills is very valuable. Okay. So again, when you start to run into problems and you're troubleshooting, I'm not likely to say, oh, here's where the problem is. I'm likely to say, oh, did you check here? Did you check here? What did you get? Is that correct? That kind of stuff. More guiding, not telling you where the problem is. Okay. Okay. We're just about done here. So I already talked about, start with modifying your RCA, check that out, then do your validity checker. Now, how many test cases are you going to have for your validity checker since there's 3 inputs? You're going to have 8 test cases, right? So this is 8. All right. And then after you've done this, because, like I said before, you already have a decoder. So you're using the same decoder as you already have. You already have a 2-to-1 mux. So you're using the same mux. You're just using it multiple times. So again, it's just going to be one mux file. But then in your structural model, right, that connects all this together, you're going to have 3 lines for each mux, right? So you're just using the same mux 3 times. Right? Just like when you did your RCA, you used the same full adder file 3 times. Okay. Now, when you go to make the connections, this is also the structural model. This is also where you take care of these inverters. Okay, you have these 2 inverters. See, in your structural model, let's say we want to make this connection here. I want to connect this A input of RCA2. I want to connect it to that inverter. Well, all you would do in your structural model, your overall file that connects everything together, you would just put dot A. Okay, so in the line for that RCA2, you would just put dot A, and then you would just connect it to the inversion. So you need the tilde, the inversion of what's on the other side, which is T3. All right, so you see this dot A tilde T3 in parentheses? That would essentially model that inverter, right? Because I'm connecting A to the inversion of what's on the other side of the inverter, which is T3. Okay. The AND gate, again, in your structural model, the AND gate you take care of with an assign statement. In fact, if you go back and you look at that activity of a week or so ago, or maybe it was longer than that, I lose track. I guess it was a couple of weeks, because it was when we did the structural model. Remember, you had like pizza and sort and fruits. Well, if you look back at that activity, it had examples of this where there's like an OR gate or an OR gate, one of those, in the structural design, and it had an assign statement. And it's the same thing here, that you would just have an assign statement where the output of the AND gate is T6. So, you would put the output, whatever, that T6. Well, you can write this T6, I guess. Right, so you have assign T6 equal to, and then you would just take the 2 inputs and AND them together. Right, so you have input T, what is it, T3, the bracket 3, and then the valid output. Right, so the 2, the 2 connections to the input of that AND gate would just get ANDed together, and then you're assigning it to the output. Okay, and then the data, like connecting this B input to the 4 zeros, you do that the same way as what you did for the mux, right, in lab 3. So it's just like dot, whatever you call the input, in parentheses, the data. Same thing with this 1 here. You could just do like 1 tick mark B1. Okay, let's see. Oh, the other thing, unless you have more questions, but the last thing I want to mention is, notice that the carry out of the RCAs are not connected to anything. Why is that? Like, why don't we care about the carry out?
Because the carry, the 60.
Yeah,
They don't matter.
yeah, exactly. See, the carry out, that's this bit that's to the left of the sum bit, right? And see, this is your sum output right here. So the carry out is the bit to the left of the sign bit, which we don't care about. Okay, so that's an example of, sometimes you have an output of some device, and based on what you're doing, you don't care. So that's why it's not connected. Now, when you run a simulation with this being not connected, you're likely to get a warning. There'll probably be some warning that effectively says, hey, carry out's not connected. But you don't care. You meant it not to be connected. So, all right, but it's warning you just in case you meant to connect it. Okay.
So in our community trigger, one of the inputs is S3. What is that?
S3, that's the output of this. So actually, I guess it would be T3. You could, same thing as T3. It's the output of this first RCA, right? Because this is where we're doing our, addition or subtraction right here. So you want to check the sign bit of your result, right? And compare it to the sign bits of what you're adding or subtracting. to see whether it's following these rules or not, right? Right, because if I got two negatives coming in and this S3 here, right, two negatives coming in, if this was a 0, meaning it was a positive result, well, that's invalid.
So there should be like a connect.
What's that?
Should be a line connecting T3 to.
Oh, right. Instead of drawing a line from here up to here and like here over to there, it was just done in this shorthand fashion, just to make the diagram not cluttered. Yeah, yeah, I understand why you're asking now. Yeah, it's just, this is a cleaner way of doing it.
Will there be like low level diagrams with the midterm? Or like drawing the level diagrams?
Well, on the midterm, now, remember, I gave everybody a handout with the topics, and that topics handout, it's on Canvas under the meeting that says midterm, for next week. And yeah, the midterm covers everything from the start of the course all the way through today. On Tuesday of next week, we're going to start into sequential circuits. Okay, so we're going to start talking about circuitry that has memory. That will not be part of the midterm. So the midterm, what you're responsible for the midterm essentially ends with today's class. So yeah, I do expect, now it might not be as involved as this, but I do expect that you can, look at a diagram similar to what we've been doing in the lab and understand what's going on. Yeah, I would say when you study for the midterm, I would definitely go over activities. I would go through the notes. Now, if you haven't been taking notes and relying on the recordings, I would watch the recordings again and, make sure that, you understand, right? That's the big thing. Sometimes people can go through problems and just through like rote memory, they sometimes can be fooled into thinking they understand it when it's more just rote memory. So I would make sure as you're going through whatever, problems or, activities we've done, that you're actually understanding what's being done. What's on the midterm is likely to be different, but similar, right? That as long as you understood what you're doing in the activities and, the examples I was going in class, you should be able to, understand what's on the midterm. Yeah, I would say if somebody's, been understanding what's going on, like you've been doing the work, also the lab work, look at the labs. Labs are a good way to reinforce, that's why we always have the lab at the end of the lecture activity, because when you start applying things, hopefully that's like a deeper understanding. So, make sure you've understood what we're doing in the labs. I mean, a lot of the lab work you've been doing, it's just been like another activity, right? So. Any other questions about anything today or about the midterm or anything like that? I think, the other thing I wanted to mention here is that the test cases are on Canvas for last reading. Let's look at that real quick. Let me just show you a couple of things on Canvas. And then you can get started working on the lab. All right. One up here. Okay, so yeah, this first thing, that's the activity. Resolution's not good, but like I said before, it's showing me that you can take one of those intermediate signals, put it onto the timing diagram. Again, the activity is each student, okay, not table, right? Because I want to make sure everyone can do it. Okay, and show me on your computer or one of our computers. And here's the test cases. Okay, these are the test cases for lab 4. So remember, this circuit is designed such to interpret whatever you put on A and B as 2's complement. Okay, so these are in base 10 here, but of course you'll have to figure out the switch positions for each of these. And please do these in order. Okay, and also, as you can see here, well, you'll be able to see when you click on Canvas, because again, the resolution's not good here. But on the left, this is the A input, and on the right is the B input. So make sure, because these test cases weren't picked haphazardly. Okay, they each demonstrate something. They make sure like they're all like different combinations of positive and negative with A and B switching and things like that. So if you do these, like if you flip A and B, you could possibly not get credit for it because it won't necessarily show that it's 100% working. So don't switch A and B, and also do these in the order that they're listed here. That will make it easier for the grader to make sure that you're doing these test cases that are given. If you do different test cases, you won't get credit. Okay, they have to be these test cases, these exact numbers. Okay. And let's see. Yeah, here. Yeah, this is the video I was talking about. Dr. Benson made this video on troubleshooting, and that she shows you what I want you to demo to me. Okay. All right. So, any questions before you get started? Because you got the rest of the class time to work on Lab 4. You have a question? Right. Yeah, those test cases are for the overall. Yeah. Yeah, the test cases that are shown on Canvas for all the labs are for the overall. Again, you know, you have to still simulate the lower level modules, but that's determined by, you know, what the lower level module is doing. We already talked about the validity checker, you need 8 test cases. And then for the RCA, when you modify it, I would do the same 10 test cases you did previously, and then do 10 more where you're adding 1, right? Because make CN equal to 1 for those additional 10. Okay. All right. And I think there was only one change. There was only one group that wanted to change lab groups, and I sent emails to the people that it affected. So look to see if you got an email. If you didn't get an email, I didn't hear from anyone else. So it's the same lab groups if you didn't get an email. Okay. And if you do have new lab partners and you don't know who they are, let me know and I can introduce them. I got it. Okay. I'm not doubting.
Dude, yeah, I woke up today, 8:02, and I'll bring at 8:02. I was like,
Yep.
fuck,
Well,
never-
Yeah, that was what I was gonna
I
do
woke up
next.
at 8:20. Then you were in here. Huh? 8:30. Wait, how come your name was on?
What do you mean all the ones after my sister's graduation?
Say that again?
Yeah. Would anything after my sister's graduation be excused? Because I live far away. Not far away, but like I live in Sacramento, so it's not like I could just like rush home and like.
No, gradually, that's,
Okay.
yeah, that's reasonable. Yeah.
Okay. I was
Like a
just-
wedding, really, in a way.
Okay. Well, I was gonna send out emails to all my professors because it's in 2
Yeah,
weeks.
that's what you should do,
It's in 2
because
weeks.
anytime, well, no, I think it's more for a family emergency. Like family emergencies, a good thing to do is to contact student affairs, because I think they do that for you. Like they'll contact all your instructors and say, you know, but yeah, for graduation, yeah.
Okay. I just was wondering if that was like an excuse.
Yeah, I don't know if it's like, there's a list on the Cal Poly website that the university, I don't know if that's specifically on there, but I would say that's reasonable because that's a big event. So, yeah.
Okay.
Okay,
Oh, also,
Yeah,
she's
just-
coming in
just-
next year.
Just send like a, I don't know, there's some sort of invitation type thing or something that she has as a date.
Yeah.
Just send that, because again, it's not, I don't leave you or anything,
Yeah.
it's just.
You need a document.
Yeah, I have to have it from one person, I get to have it from everyone.
That makes sense. She's also coming in next year. She
Oh,
committed
good. Oh, so she committed, you said?
Yeah,
Oh,
to
okay,
EE
what,
here.
what major?
EE.
Oh, E, oh, okay, good. Yeah, what's her name again?
My name or her name?
Her name.
Oh, Morgan.
Morgan. Oh, okay. Okay, good.
But yeah, she'll probably end up taking 133 this fall.
Oh, okay.
Because she has like a bunch of things.
Yeah, EE's take it, I think, their second year. Won't be this long.
Oh, they're second year.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure, because they take their orientation classes.
Which is always-
I mean,
She's a
some
ton of credit.
some EEs take it like now, because like in this class, it's like 50% EE, 50% CPE. But I think on the flow chart, well, again, I think it also depends like what catalog you're on, because there's some differences.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I've got a question.
Okay.
For this specific.
Well, when I wrote this, this is what. This is coming out of this, it's gonna get inverted. So that's what I put here. So now, you know, I didn't write it, but here we have, because it's gonna take this inversion, add it here, and also add it one. So at the output, this would be. But at the output here, you 0, 1, if you take the two components, that's right. Is this one. 0, 1.
I felt like. Yeah, in the old part.
Yeah, because again, if we didn't have, it's like if we had connected this element right to this, it would display an A instead of 6.
Isn't that?
All I need to know.
Yeah. Oh, that's it. And I like theater. There's a tower. I live in a tower.
Okay.
I just like take a video of it big and then like show myself.
Yeah.
Staring at it. And like, well, goodbye.
Let me think about it, but yeah, we can do something.
Okay, if that doesn't work, we'll do my next option.
Well, let me think about it, I mean, let's just see, 'cause, you know, it just relates, if I let one person get out, like, everybody would rather have it in person, but let's just see if there's more than one person that has a problem also with it.
I just don't have that.
Yeah. No, I know, because the whole quarter.
Oh, yeah, you know, that's so.
I finished it up. But after I read mine, and then
I finished up doing the.
Yeah, that might be. Let me just see if there's any other people in the same boat. Yeah, but that sounds reasonable, what she suggested.